And world leaders, climate experts and activists are meeting in Madrid as global climate change talks kick off. The UN Climate Summit, also known as COP25, will take place over the next 2 weeks. The aim is to come up with a game plan to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of global warming. A UN report to be released tomorrow will confirm that the last 5 years were the warmest on record. And for more on this, we're joined by Dr. Lisa Schipper, Research Fellow at the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University. Dr. Schipper, firstly, the UN chief has said that we are at the point of no return. How does this set the tone for this year's conference?
Yeah, I think that's a really accurate way to talk about it. I mean, we've had really what we can say sort of underwhelming energy coming from the previous meetings and the UN Climate Action Summit that was held in September. And if we don't see key countries turning up the political momentum at COP25, we're unlikely to see this sort of huge shift that we need in time for COP26 next year, which is when we really have to see the plans for reducing greenhouse gas emissions even more ambitious. And I think we should keep in mind that we now have 3 special IPCC reports, special reports that spell out in no uncertain terms that climate change is happening and the time to take action is slipping by, and that each day we wait means that the efforts are even greater. And we also have a civil society that is super engaged through the Fridays for Future movement and school strikes. And we have technology and know-how, but what we're really missing is the political will.
So saying all that, you mentioned that before COP26, when nations must submit new climate action plans, what will be top on the agenda then?
So top on the agenda is basically making sure that we have this Paris rulebook complete. And the Paris rulebook would say how to implement the Paris Agreement. It was almost completed at COP24 last year, but there is a key outstanding issue, which is essentially which is called Article 6, and it's about finding cooperative mechanisms for meeting our emission targets. And one of the key things there includes setting a price on carbon so that we can develop a carbon market. And this is proving very difficult. Other issues have to do with the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, which is basically one of the discussion issues is under which of the many UNFCCC bodies this mechanism should sit under, which would determine whether or not countries that are not part of the Paris Agreement, most notably the United States, would be party to it or not. So those are 2 of the key issues that are being discussed here.
Dr. Schipper, China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. How much pressure is Beijing under to commit to more reductions?
Well, so following last week's reports on how greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, focus really needs to be on the countries and companies that are responsible for the largest amounts of these emissions. And China is obviously one of these. So yes, pressure is very high. But what's interesting right now is that we have more than 70 countries that have already committed to being net zero by 2050. China is not one of these, and the EU as a bloc is not one of these either. But of course, it's important because China is the biggest emitter. So we are looking at them, and there is a lot of pressure.
What about the U.S.? You know, Mr. Trump is not in Madrid. How much progress can actually be made without Washington's involvement and commitment then?
Okay, so this is a bit trickier because the U.S. has now pulled out of the Paris Agreement officially, although that won't actually take place until November 2020. But this means that their voice in any of the negotiations on the Paris Agreement issues would essentially not be so important at this point. But still, of course, because they're one of the biggest emitters, this discussion around carbon pricing will be sort of lopsided without them there. And I think what's important to remember is that happening outside of the walls of this conference center is this trade deal between the US and China that's being negotiated. And I think that might play an important role in terms of what China is willing to agree on in terms of climate change as well.
You've described quite a few obstacles ahead of us. How hopeful are you then that anything can be settled in Madrid?
I think we just have to stay hopeful because otherwise there's not a lot left. I mean, in some ways, you know, we know that we have to cut emissions now, and we also have to keep in mind that in order to be able to cut emissions, we need to have all sorts of policies and programs in place to make sure that people who lose out as a result of cutting emissions will also have a kind of a just transition into a different livelihood. So essentially, we have to keep working and keep thinking about how we can help everybody. I try to remain hopeful, but I think that the reality is that if we don't see this political will at this meeting, after this year that's been so crucial in terms of all the action and the momentum outside of government, we are not really on track for something ambitious at COP26 next year, unfortunately.
All right, well, many thanks for your thoughts this evening. Dr. Lisa Schipper, Research Fellow at the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University.